Welcome to Trust Talk. Today we are joined by Sandra Sucher, professor of management practice at Harvard Business School and one of the most respected thinkers on how trust is built, lost, and restored. This is not theory in isolation. Sandra brings us into boardrooms and crisis rooms where pressure is intense, uncertainty is real, and trust becomes the difference between resilience and breakdown. You will hear what happened inside Boeing as it worked to rebuild trust after 2 aircraft crashed and the world demanded accountability. You will see Nokia confronting the human reality of layoffs, where leadership under pressure revealed whether people truly mattered. We step into the Financial Times newsroom, where early and transparent decisions on AI set a new benchmark for trust in a fast-shifting media landscape. You will learn from Twiddy Co, navigating the chaos of the pandemic with clarity, honesty, and resolve. And we travel to Japan to explore Itochu's long-term approach to trust, where business, customers, and society advance together. This episode offers a rare look at what it truly takes to lead with trust when chaos hits, pressure rises, and the stakes could not be higher. Your host, Severin DeWitt.
Sandra, welcome back to Trust Talk. When we first spoke in February 2022, you walked us through your research on how trust is built, lost, and repaired. Since then, you have been busy turning those ideas into practice, working directly with leaders, developing real-world cases, and teaching future executives in your Building Trusted Organizations course at Harvard Business School. Today, I would like to pick up where we left off and hear what you have learned from applying your work inside organizations and across industries. When you started working directly with leaders, what was the biggest gap between what executives say about trust and what they actually do?
I've never met a leader who didn't think that trust was important. So this isn't a question of leaders saying this issue isn't relevant to me. The gap was that they didn't treat trust as something they could do something about. They treated it as kind of a feeling, an aspiration on their end, and they didn't believe that there was anything that they could concretely do to influence the extent to which they were trusted. Now, I don't actually blame them for that. If you think historically, the study of trust is kind of where the quality movement was in the 1970s and 1980s, meaning everyone thought that quality was a good idea. And very few people had kind of figured out, well, but what can we actually do to get better quality in our organizations? And I think trust is kind of at that space right now.
You often say trust is an asset that requires investment. Where do leaders most resist making that investment, and what helps them cross that line?
I think the area where there's the biggest opportunity to build trust is in how leaders manage and build their products and services. It's the way that customers experience the firm, and it's the foundation for why they're trusted. And what they do when they develop them is quite understandable. They think about the benefits from kind of their perspective out to the customer. Here's what we think we're doing. Here's how we think this could work for you. And when you take a trust perspective, you have to acknowledge that it's the other party that trusts you. And so if you're going to do that, you have to start with, well, how does this product actually work for them? How is it actually functioning for them? And the companies that do this the best pay very careful attention to their current products and the way that they're actually perceived and used and the problems that they have with them in order to build a solid foundation for trust.
In your work, what is one moment where you watched trust click for a leader when they shifted from trust is soft to trust drives results?
In 2014, there was in Kazakhstan, their local currency was devalued to keep it in par with the Russian currency. And it was a huge devaluation. And people saw an extreme loss of their financial ability to pay for things. And there was a rumor that got started on WhatsApp, which is that his bank and 2 others were going to go under because of needing to actually fulfill people's demands for their deposits. And so they managed that brilliantly. What they did was they showed up at all the branches, the senior leaders did. They flew in money from other branches. They kept them open for 72 hours. to make sure that every single person who was in line could get however much money they wanted to get out. And at the beginning of this, they had lost 10% of deposits. And in the end, they still had only lost 10% of deposits. And even after having done such a remarkably effective recovery, at the end, his conclusion was, we really need to work harder on being trusted. If we were trusted, people wouldn't have been lined upside my bank. I asked to get their money back.
We focus on a few more companies this podcast on real-time cases. One is Twiddy and Company. For those who listen to our podcast who don't know the company, maybe tell us a bit what they do.
Twiddy and Company is a vacation home sales and rental business. So their primary clients are homeowners who want to rent out their vacation homes. They're situated on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, which is a long chain of barrier islands that are connected to the mainland of North Carolina by a bridge. And so they have homeowners, they have the guests who want to rent the properties, and they help manage the properties on behalf of the homeowners and get them marketed and rented and all of that. And they sell and help sell or buy the homes if people want to leave them. So the problem that they ran into was that during the pandemic, very early in March of 2020, the North Carolina government, out of a grave concern that the local health infrastructure, their hospital, would be overwhelmed by people coming from the mainland to be in these vacation homes, they closed the bridges that connected the mainland to these barrier islands. And this was the situation that he had to manage.
During the pandemic, Twiddy had to make decisions with incomplete information and an enormous pressure. When you look at the case now, what is the most misunderstood aspects of leading with trust in a chaotic environment?
The kind of most important element that you need to manage well is information. If you're in a chaotic environment like the pandemic, like terrorist wars, people are hungry for information. And there's no certainty. The cause and effect relationships are not clear, too many variables at work for anyone to actually sensibly claim that they could predict what's happening. And so the gap that needs to be filled at that point, if you want to be a trusted organization, is people's need for information, even if incomplete and even if very time limited. So they set up a series of virtual town halls for all of their homeowners. They did every week, and they had a format. They talked about the fact of what we are seeing right now, what we're doing right now, what we don't know, and what you can expect from us for the next week. They answered questions from homeowners like, when will the bridges reopen? Do I have to refund the money that I've taken from someone who wants to stay in my home? Some of these they had answers to, some of them they had to go find answers to. And they did the same kind of town hall process with their employees, who of course were worried about whether the business would stay viable, what was going on with reservations, and how they could be kept safe during the pandemic. So, their ability to willingly walk into this information void, be very transparent about what they knew and what they didn't know, marshal resources, including government officials, health experts, to talk with people, made them a very huge source of certainty at a time when things were very chaotic. So being able to move into that is one of the real strengths during a chaotic process.
The company Twiddy also used what's called the Cinefin framework. What's that and what has that to do with our subject?
What it is it's a framework for leaders who need to understand different levels of information and other kinds of uncertainty in the context that they're operating in. And so at the very simplest end are things that you already know how to do. The information is there, but it's a new situation. You just need to apply it. Somewhat more complicated situations, someone knows the information, but you don't. and you have to pull in experts to help you decide what to do. Businesses spend most of their time in what's referred to as a complex environment, where actually they have to get with other people to try to understand what are the facts, what's going on right now, and what should we do about it. And then a chaotic environment, which I was describing a second ago, that's when these cause and effect relationships are so unpredictable that all you can do is to act within a very time-limited time frame, but you need to get control of the situation.
So another company is Itochu Corporation. It's a Japanese trading company, and they build trust through long-term commitments to society, not just profits. In Western companies, quarterly pressure often works against that. What have you seen leaders do practically to protect long-term trust in short-term environments?
The first is just to understand which strategies and processes and actions you're taking actually are important to your survival and thriving as a business, and to maintain the course on those things, even in the face of short-term pressures. And part of how you do that is, in some cases, you may talk less about these things, put them under the radar that allow you to pursue. So people are doing that with diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're doing that with climate change in many cases, where they're continuing to act on things, but speaking less about them. The second thing that you can do that helps you build some sense of confidence in your decision making, even with a lot of pressure, is to really focus on what you know and what the facts are. Because it's very easy to get swept up in an external narrative about what people should be doing, what this environment requires. And at that point, you have to say, well, but what about my firm? How much of that is actually going on inside my firm? And it helps build the confidence to say, I'm either going to take a different step, or at least to know exactly what it is you need to do to stay the course for what's going to make you successful.
What is the hardest part of applying that Sanpo-yoshi thinking in a Western context? Is it patience, transparency, stakeholder balancing, something else?
Patience and a long-term perspective is what differentiates people who practice this. And I'll give you a concrete example. So this is a company that believes strongly in supporting the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They identify some material issues where they want to be impactful, and then their business units come up with sustainability initiatives. One of these initiatives was to create a brand new waste management system for the city of Belgrade. This was important because it was one of the single largest open dump sites on the planet. It polluted the Danube, going all the way through Europe, Europe's second largest river. And what they have created since is a sustainable system of reducing the amount of waste that's produced, developing energy that fuels 10% of all the energy needs for the city of Belgrade by converting waste into energy, and reducing the equivalent of their greenhouse gas emissions to the equivalent of planting 2 million trees a year. Now, this was a public-private partnership that lasted for 25 years to make this happen. And so not all of their projects had that longevity, but the idea is that if you want to think big, have an impact, and aid society, you do have to have an extended time frame.
Another interesting case to discuss is the Financial Times case. Let's explain to our audience what the Financial Times case was about.
Rula Khalif, who's the editor of the Financial Times, wrote a note to subscribers describing generative AI. And the note described three things. It talked about what generative AI is, how it operates, and then how the Financial Times as a news organization intended to use it. It talked about conscious experimentation that they were tracking so that they would not willy-nilly be using generative AI in ways that may or may not be useful, and a governance structure that allowed them to put guardrails around the use and the output that people would see. And mainly, it was a commitment that the news would always be powered by humans. Now, I must say that we're taping this now in November of 2025. That was in May of 2023, 6 months after ChatGPT launched. And I've yet to see another public statement from a corporation about their strategy for how they're going to employ generative AI. This is particularly important for the Financial Times as a news organization because people rely on it. And this is something that Rula Khalif understands very deeply. The trust is a willingness to be vulnerable to other people's actions and intentions. And the news is one place where that's huge. And so she wanted to make sure that people could continue to have faith in their ability to trust the Financial Times, even as they experimented with the use of this new technology.
What signals around AI adoption build trust, and which ones unintentionally undermine it, even when intentions are good?
One signal is kind of who's making the decision about this. Another is whether people are investing in this as potentially transformative technology. And what that means is that you have to provide training. You have to, in particular, support the first line managers. These are the people who actually have to manage other people's adoption of generative AI. And this creates a third job for them. They already have to sort of be good soldiers in the organization. They have to develop their people, and now they have to lead this transformation. So the more that you tend to see things like that, the more you can say, okay, this organization has its arms around this generative AI potential transformation.
Sandra, you study companies that try to recover trust after major failures. What is one thing leaders consistently underestimate about the time and the emotional labor required to rebuild trust?
What happens is that if you imagine that you're on the board of Boeing and trying to figure out, should we redesign this airplane? And the decision they made a decade earlier was, and then again at that time was, no, we're not going to redesign the plane from scratch. It had already been redesigned 11 times. But it was obviously cheaper and faster to put yet another redesign of this particular model in the air. That was the first mistake that they made, and that's part of the normalcy bias, which is not recognizing that there's some point at which the redesign itself would make the plane unstable. The biggest problem with the normalcy bias is when the crisis then hits. And what happens is that people are, in general, very slow to recognize how big, how expensive, and how long this management of the crisis is going to take. And that's the normalcy bias at work. It's when people kind of just don't see that this thing could spiral out of control, and we have to think big right now in order to manage it. Some companies do that well. Boeing, in this particular instance, did not.
Looking at Boeing and maybe also Nokia, where did leaders miss the human dimension of trust repair? And what would you coach them to do differently today?
We tend to not want to see the individuals that we've harmed as kind of real people. And so we don't acknowledge their humanity. We don't put ourselves in their shoes. And so an example at Boeing was they had decided that they knew the victims needed some form, meaning the families of people who'd been killed in the crash, needed some form of compensation, but without consulting them, they simply decided they were going to donate some money to some charities to try to make this work. You can imagine that if you're someone whose family member's been killed, you not only don't appreciate that gesture, it's insulting to not be consulted about something that's supposed to be for your benefit. And so this is what you can see. It's kind of a sign of dehumanizing the other, or I kind of, in a performative way, go through the motions, but don't really think about the fact that I need to consult with them in order to make sure that what I'm doing actually would allow them to not necessarily trust me again, but to at least not hate me.
Sandra, I just mentioned Nokia. You may later explain what that case was about, but I think it showed that layoffs can be handled in ways that either destroy trust or maintain it. And so my question would be, what is one concrete decision point in a restructuring where leaders reveal their true motive? Is it performance or is it people?
The Nokia situation is kind of a story of a bad layoff and a good layoff. So the bad layoff was 2008 in Bochum, Germany, and this was a factory that they had been in for 30 years. They decided to close the factory in the midst of record profits because it wasn't actually profitable for them to keep manufacturing the phones in Germany because of labor costs, compared to labor costs in factories in other countries around the world where they similarly had manufacturing capacity. This was managed without a notice to the people who were involved and ended up being the most expensive layoff settlement, at least that I'm aware of almost 80,000 euros per worker to try to exit. And also it took 4 or 5 months for them to do the negotiations with the government and all of that. So at the end of this, Nokia knew that this was very radioactive territory. And then in 2011, 2010 in particular, when the iPhone came out and they had their first genuinely serious competitor, and then Android in the smartphone market, they realized that their phone business was under extreme duress and they were going to have to do a major restructuring. And that required 18,000 people across 13 countries, and they managed that very differently and better.
The last case is Dungeons and Dragons. Maybe you can briefly explain what the case was about and what had that to do with trust.
They decided to change the terms of the contract, that players and the creators who actually contribute to the way that these games are played would have the freedom to kind of do things they've done in the past, and also ownership of the contribution that they make to the ecosystem. Dungeons and Dragons changed these contract terms, and it created a huge furor in their ecosystem when both the people who play the games, the creators who help them build and manage these games, just hated what they did. They ended up having to walk back this recontracting. But to this day, according to people I know who are quite avid gamers, they still have not recovered the trust of people who actually just said, how can you take away this thing that was important to me without consulting me in a way that was useful?
Finally, what gives you the most hope right now about the future of trust in leadership?
So I had described a couple of the papers that my students in my course, Building Trusted Organization, are writing. And so these are not assignments that I make. They're situations that they themselves want to study. And so one person was somewhat familiar with the Tata family and how they managed the Mumbai bombings in one of their hotels and the attack on the hotel. Another person had firsthand experience with the Google layoffs and wanted to examine them in more details, trust failures. So, this shows that there's work to be done, things to be known, and at least for the students in my course, people who want to do that work.
Sandra, thank you again for joining us. It's always a pleasure to learn from your work and the real-world examples you bring. I appreciate your time and the insights you shared with us today. Thank you for that.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Trust Talk. We hope today's conversation inspired new insights into the transformative power of trust. At Trust Talk, we're committed to exploring trust's role in shaping a better world, one story at a time. If our mission resonates with you, we invite you to support us. Your donation, no matter the size, helps us continue these meaningful conversations. Visit us at trusttalk.co/donate to contribute and be part of this journey. Thank you for listening and being part of the Trust Talk community. We can't wait to have you join us again for the next episode.